Welcome, everybody. My name is Philip Reitinger, and I'm the president and CEO of the Global Cyber Alliance. And today we're going to be talking to the New York City Chief Information Security Officer and Head of Cyber Command, Geoff Brown, and several members from his team about Cyber Command, what it does for New York City, and what its mission is. So to begin, Geoff, welcome. Glad to have you.
So
Could
happy
you
to be here.
quickly could you quickly introduce yourself to the audience, please?
Okay. Well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be. My name is Geoff Brown, Chief Information Security Officer for the City of New York and head of the Office of New York City Cyber Command.
Great, thanks, Geoff. Cyber Command is sort of it's a unique name for an organization in a city. When people in the United States think of Cyber Command, they typically think of DoD and an organization that has perhaps an offensive mission that I'm sure you don't have. Tell us a little bit about the journey that got New York City from having, an office of a CISO to having a Cyber Command with a bigger mission.
Certainly. So I think, as you noted, we certainly are a very different organization than US Cyber Command. But I think just in the name of the organization, New York City Cyber Command, you get an idea of how serious the city government, the city apparatus takes cybersecurity. That's really why that name was chosen. And I think the best way to start is to give you really the vision of the program. That's how New York City thinks about cybersecurity. And New York City has a goal to be the most cyber resilient city in the world. That's the vision. That's what we pursue each and every day via our work, via all the things we do, our innovation, our people, our strategies, etc. But that's the vision. That's what we're aiming at. And then how do we do that? We really have two key missions, the way we think about it. One is an enterprise mission. Just like great large enterprises the world over, whether it be in the private sector, the public sector, a non-for-profit, anything like that, New York City government is a large enterprise. It's an enterprise that's composed of the compute power, the technology, of course, of over 100 city agencies and offices all serving New York. And the mission for us therein, the enterprise mission, is to defend the services that those agencies provide. And we do that by defending the technology. The second core mission for New York City Cyber Command, and it's very unique and something we're very proud of, is public facing. So New York City made a decision, I'm sure we'll talk about it today, made a decision that cybersecurity is a public safety issue and an essential service, and the way that we can provide cybersecurity for New Yorkers should respect their values. We call that the NYC Secure initiative, which we'll talk about a little bit today. But those are the really two core missions, all that we pursue after that vision to make New York City cyber resilient.
Thanks, Geoff. That's super interesting. Let's start with the NYC Secure Mission. New York City is one of the largest metropolitan areas in the world, and pretty clearly, the or one of the major economic centers. How did you get to the point where an element of city government decided to take on the mission of defending not just the city government infrastructure, but the whole of the city? That's something that people think about national governments doing, maybe states, less metropolitan areas.
So great question, and really important question, and something I'm always proud to talk about. So the way we got there was very much looking at all the incredible things that the city government must do. In fact, any government must do vis-a-vis their sort of their contract with their people, right? We're all public servants, and the things that the city government does to help New Yorkers in the physical space as we move into our future. And in fact, in many ways, we're already there. The city government made a decision that we should do everything we can to do those same things in the digital space. There's some important considerations there, and one, I often receive the question on the New York City Secure Initiative, well, isn't there a ton to do to defend those services via the technical footprint of the city itself? Of course there is. But all of us involved in cybersecurity and the community of cyber defenders worldwide know that we make progress towards that absolute goal of being totally secure. But we make progress each and every day, but it is a goal far off on the horizon. So we work to close gaps, we work to do the best we can to be prepared to respond. We do all that important work. And the question I always received is, if you still have work to do there, how can you even embark on a journey like NYC Secure that's public facing? And the answer simply is, you can't wait to finish that enterprise journey to start to work on the obligation we have to New Yorkers in our city, the obligation we have to the citizen that we have a government sort of social contract with, right? And so we decided we needed to begin that journey in New York City. And the other important thing here, and I'm happy to talk about the specific techniques, tactics that we've deployed. The other important thing is we made a decision that those things that we do for New Yorkers themselves has to respect their values. So the types of cyber defense measures that you may bring into an enterprise setting may not be the most appropriate things to do when you're offering a public service. And so we made some of those determinations, those principle-based determinations early on, and then we started to design tactics. And I have to pay a compliment to the Global Cyber Alliance, because one of the things we did very early on was make a decision, just like the Global Cyber Alliance has the tagline, do things and measure those things, right? Something like that. We wanted to make sure we could do things that were measurable, that made a almost scientific difference if New Yorkers chose to avail themselves of them.
Thanks, Geoff. I can't emphasize how important it is to have concrete outcomes as a result of the work. And I think not to be overly complimentary, but it's been pretty amazing what New York City's been able to accomplish. You said you could talk a little bit more about the specific initiatives that you took on. Please unpack those a little bit for us.
Certainly. So again, these initiatives are under that recognition that cybersecurity is a public safety issue, an essential service, and the things that we do in New York to respect New Yorkers' values. That was the foundational principle in the statement in NYC Secure. And the things we did were twofold so far, and that's an exciting thing to say, so far, because I know there's more to come. One is we developed an app that we call the NYC Secure App, and we put that app up for free on the Apple and the Google app stores. That app itself was designed from the get-go in a very specific way. So it was designed so that it would do threat detection and alerting on the device, on the mobile device itself, but it would not send data, PII relevant data or personal data away for that threat decisioning. We wanted the magic to be on the device because we recognize, of course, that we didn't want to be invasive to what that New Yorker might be doing on the device. So we deployed that app, and we're proud that many New Yorkers have chosen to put that on their tablets, their mobile devices. We have over 100,000 downloads, and I think that's really terrific progress, and I think there's more to come. The app gives us a foundation to build out other capabilities, awareness type capabilities, but the key on that is that it provides what I call decision support. So in the end, it is informing the New Yorker to navigate away from the threats they may encounter. It doesn't do that work for them. So it's part of this awareness and education, because everybody has to play a role in cyber defense. We also believe via that measure that the better protected that individual device is, and the better protected the whole is. So this a little bit in the digital space of the philosophy of herd immunity. The second thing we did, so the first thing was the free app, NYC Secure App, which you can go to the Google Store or the Apple Store right now and download. The second thing we did was in the Wi-Fi space. Within New York City, we know that providing internet everywhere is an important thing. So there's been some initiative to make sure that the internet's rolled out across all 5 boroughs. And very interestingly, our good partners at Global Cyber Alliance were founders of something called Quad 9, along with Packet Clearinghouse and IBM and some other global organizations. The neat thing about Quad 9, and the reason why we selected it, is it does DNS security. but it does DNS secure in a way where it isn't capturing those queries or providing any categorization-based blocks. So it really fit this proposition that what we did for New Yorkers under this public-facing umbrella should align with their values. And I'm proud to say, again, that we've deployed Quad 9 in every place in the city where the city is providing free public Wi-Fi. And to sum these two tactics up, you asked originally really what brought the city to this decision. It was really quite simple. There was some briefings that my team and I partook in to bring to the attention in City Hall, to the highest levels of the executive in City Hall, our proposal. And the best thing is when we got to that level in the briefings, it was pretty simple. We said, quite simply, the city does an incredible amount in the physical space to help New Yorkers be safer. And we think as more New Yorkers live their lives digitally, we have an obligation to do as much as we can. And it was very simple. I remember that day quite clearly. The response we got was, that makes sense. It's the right thing to do. Now what are we going to do? And that's how, from that sort of blessing, we came up with the two tactics. So I always like to go back to that thought process. It's the right thing to do, so let's just go do that.
That's a super exciting story. One of the things that I find so interesting about the approach that New York City is taking, Geoff, is that you really have understood from the start the problem of scale, that you have to reach everybody, not just in the government, but throughout the city. And you've got to find a way to get people to implement things when they have other things to do. So it's about transparency. It's about reducing barriers to entry. It's about making things available and really simple. And you guys are hitting the ball out of the park on that. Before we go to the members of your team, I also wanted to talk a little bit about what you're doing specifically on the city side, so the government side, the first of those two missions. And what are the major strategic pillars associated with that effort?
Another great question, and this really goes to the very beginning. We decided on three core things. The first, as everybody in cybersecurity knows, maybe this will be no surprise, is visibility. So when you have a compute sort of landscape that rivals the largest enterprises in the world when it comes to just pure number of assets, we knew we need to get as much visibility and then as much actionability at the very end of that chain as possible. So we worked very hard on an endpoint strategy that would do behavioral based blocks as fast as possible, and then would send that telemetry so that our threat management function could do the great work that they do. So we've increased our visibility and actionability well over half a million endpoints and beyond from where it was originally, which was not at that volume. And that's really important because when you think about all of the different agencies and all the different services they provide, all the different technology they may have, we needed a strategy that would allow us to go very precisely to those assets wherever they might be, so we could do in an automated function the best work that we could. And I think you'll probably hear a little bit about that from my colleagues Quiessence, Phillips, and Colin Ahern in a little bit. The second thing we did, another important piece of our strategy, was just simple thought process: defend the defenders. So in any enterprise, of course, you have a whole spread of different types of technologies, some of which, of course, is legacy. We had the opportunity very early on, as we were starting to form New York City Cyber Command, to create some underpinnings of our strategy that we would be cloud friendly, cloud first, whatever cloud term you want to use, and unafraid of the cloud. And we were able to, because of those choices, build our own environment with the strongest identity and access controls available, with our right data pipeline, and that really set our foundation to protect those defenders. Heaven forbid, as we've seen across the landscape, parts of the enterprise encounter operationally disruptive cyber events. We still needed our defenders to be able to prosecute their mission, and so we built our own environment. I think you'll probably hear a little bit about that again from my colleagues. The last piece, and maybe the most fundamental piece, and the thing that I tend to talk to other cities about quite often, is we had to organize. Organizing for the mission was incredibly important. Organizing in a way where we could have, in all honesty, accountability and responsibility. Both those things are important. A lot of times in cybersecurity, people go after responsibility and authority, but they don't necessarily go after accountability. And we were able to achieve that via an order that the mayor gave back in 2017, his Executive Order 28, and that created New York City Cyber Command. It took our office from a reporting structure into the technology department into a reporting structure into City Hall, and allowed us very much to have that mature enterprise risk conversation across business lines, technology lines, security lines, finance, etc. And that was the right place for the city to decide to put its cybersecurity accountability. And then you'll see that continued this past September. The City Council followed on with legislation, and via that legislation, putting the Office of New York City Cyber Command into the charter. What that really says is that at the highest levels, the highest elected officials in the city all agree that cybersecurity is an absolutely critical service in our city.
Thanks, Geoff. That's really interesting. One of the things DHS has been doing at a federal level is releasing some toolkits called Cyber Essentials. And apropos of your last point, the very first toolkit they released was on leadership and getting the leadership involved. I've liked to say for a long time that if you have executive commitment, you can really get just about anything done. And if you don't have executive commitment, you're not going to be successful no matter what. So achieving that permanence, getting that buy-in at a political level, it's really a pretty amazing achievement. One other thing I wanted to talk with you about before moving on to your team, can you talk a little bit about how you're working with the private sector and what that looks like as a citywide initiative? We always talk about cybersecurity being a team sport, and it clearly is. So how do you build that team outside the city?
Such an important question. Two primary things here. One, in partnership with the Global Cyber Alliance, an initiative was stood up in New York City that we call Cyber Critical Services and Infrastructure. That initiative is comprised of many different industries and verticals, private sector, public sector, but selfishly focused on the cybersecurity mission in the city itself. And that effort has run a number of joint tabletops, et cetera, so that, and it's very basic level. We know that an event, a significantly impactful cybersecurity event against one, will in fact have either direct or indirect consequences to all. And so many organizations in the city of New York have stood together, recognizing that consequences of not acting together, not knowing how to act in unison, and have practiced together and had a number of collaborative sessions so that we can work together. And I also have to recognize very much that our industry is one where we get an incredible amount of innovation from the private sector. New York City, under its Economic Development Corporation, launched an initiative to start to stimulate that engine. And that engine is important for the cyber defense of the city and also important for the economy of the city, creating cybersecurity jobs, making sure those jobs themselves reflect the diversity and the inclusion that makes New York City a great city. These are all things that we think about and act on. The other thing that I think is incredibly important to note is some of these, think of them as influential players, are at the enterprise scale. But when it comes down to it, the mission in New York City, just like the recognition on the NYC Secure initiative, the mission in New York City is about serving the people. So we had to really think about serving people, not just in NYC Secure, but people in the way of the things that they care about, and they care about their businesses, their livelihood, etc. So I am proud to say that I think New York City is a participant in Global Cyber Alliance who releases things, and we publicize when Global Cyber Alliance does things like the Small Business Toolkit. I think that underbelly of what matters to New Yorkers is where the government needs to meet them. And that's why we're proud to be partners with an organization like Global Cyber Alliance who push out these toolkits, because that can help that individual person who may not be at the scale of a big private sector company, but rightfully so, cares an incredible amount that what they do for their customers is safe and secure and wants to do everything they can. And so we make sure that we can, like, using our voice, vocalize then forward the great work like the Small Business Toolkit.
Great, Geoff. Sorry, I'm talking occasionally into my mic because I'm muting it because my son's playing trumpet upstairs. So my apologies to all the listeners about that. I'm muting when I'm not talking. I think that's a critical point. I often think about this as sort of at two levels, right? There's the critical infrastructure pieces. They're worried about advanced persistent threats and all of those sorts of things. And then there's the big scale problem for everybody. And you've got to really be able to tackle both of those because otherwise you really don't have an economy. And that's essential for any modern metropolitan area or country or the world. So let's bring in your colleagues, Colin Ahern and Quiessence Phillips, and get them involved in the conversation. Don't go away though, Geoff, because we'll get back to you at the end after we have a conversation with some of the folks on your team. So perhaps I could ask the two of you to introduce yourself. Quiessence, could we start with you?
Sure thing. Hi, Phil. So my name is Quiessence Phillips, also known as Q. I am the Deputy CISO for the City of New York and Head of Threat Management for New York City Cyber Command. Essentially, that is everything encompassing our detection to our response and mitigation efforts within our Security Operations Center, our incident response team, cyber threat intelligence, and counter threat automation.
Great. Thank you, Q. Sorry. Colin.
Hi, great to be with you today. I'm Colin Ahern, also a Deputy CISO for the City of New York. I head an organization called Security Sciences. We do tactical and strategic defensive technology for the City of New York, the city's endpoint program that Geoff just mentioned, the data pipeline that Geoff just mentioned, data science, software engineering, network and security architecture, et cetera.
Great, thank you. So I have a question for both of you to start. Geoff talked about the big strategic elements of the city-focused program. Transparency, defend the defenders, and sort of accountability. What do the two of you see as particularly unique and compelling about the approach that New York City is taking?
Sure,
Q, why don't we start?
I'll start.
Go ahead.
And then Q can jump in. I think, as Geoff mentioned, we had the opportunity we had a green field with our highly secure responder environment, which we built in the cloud. We didn't just lift and shift a legacy environment. We took the cloud as one of the things that deserved consideration as a first principle. So we selected as a security model something called Zero Trust, which recently has gotten a lot of focus, and I think rightly so. So that enabled us to achieve, I think, what some have called a non-linear return to scale, which means that we were able to ingest a lot of data, a lot of security telemetry in a very efficient way. Additionally, it enabled us to have extremely tight controls over the environment. Q will talk obviously in more detail from an incident response perspective, but from an infrastructure perspective, we're using declarative infrastructure as code. We're using, a technically enforced 2 and sometimes 2+ reviews of production changes. Where, obviously the Zero Trust framework, for those of you that are not familiar, is using the combination of what you know about an identity and what you know about a device and what you know about the resource being requested to make an authorization and access decision. So we're able to have an incredibly high level of fidelity about the environment on a continuous basis. Obviously, nothing is perfect, and this is a journey that we're on together, along with our great partners in the public and private sectors. But it's enabled us to, as the pandemic, it allowed us to rapidly shift to a remote-only workforce. It enabled us to ingest a lot more security data without onboarding new team members. So it's provided pretty tremendous benefit for the city since we, started this journey.
Great, thanks, Colin.
Yeah.
You?
And I'll just add to that, sure. So one of the pillars was the defend the defenders, right? In the industry, we don't always talk about defense of the defenders, which was paramount for us. So speaking to what Colin and Geoff both mentioned about the environment, the highly secure responder environment, that was huge for us essentially because we wanted to build an environment where we could thrive. We can fully integrate all of the tooling that was necessary for the effectiveness of our operation, but we also had the opportunity to bring others in. So when we think about the notion of community defense, and if we're executing on somewhat of the incident command system, we want to have the opportunity to bring in defenders, and within that environment, we can do that. Additionally, the visibility, as Geoff mentioned, was paramount for us, essentially because we wanted to have centralized monitoring, right? Centralized monitoring and detection. We can't defend what we can't see. And because we're in this unique position within the city, we're able to see systemic risk if we're collecting telemetry across the board. We're able to see if threats are impacting agencies across verticals, because in the city, we have so many different verticals. It is important, at least from an intelligence and a detection response perspective, to understand where we're seeing these threats. How are we being impacted? Are we seeing an uptick in a particular vertical over another? And that central visibility gives us that opportunity. And then I would say lastly would be the remote response, right? Being able to respond remotely in a swift and efficient manner was huge for us, and building out that environment, ensuring that we have the full visibility and the ability to take action after detection was important for us.
Let's drill down a little bit on that new environment, because I think it's particularly important, and we'll get to this in a few minutes, in the new way of working in the the sort of the remote working pandemic environment. But Q, let's start with you on this. Could you start with a little bit? Can you explain a little bit more about what that unique environment you've built is and how it functions?
Yeah, so I think Colin can speak very eloquently to this because his team is mostly responsible for building out the environment. So I'll let him answer that, but I'll talk a little bit about the impact that it has and how we're able to use that environment to be successful. So one, to your point about the pandemic, being fully remote was not something that we did before, even though we built out this environment to be able to access it from essentially anywhere. So I think even if we're thinking about like the knowns and knowns framework, right, we'll never know every input into some type of impact and a decision that we'll need to make. But if we build our environment and our program to be resilient, which includes flexibility, then we'll be able to respond accordingly. So within that environment, as I mentioned, we have the ability to remotely access from anywhere. We have the ability, because we've built the data pipeline to where at least the data that we have ingested is centrally managed and can be looked at with the eye for trends in any type of detection. When we're thinking about COVID, we had to do quick assessments on how much more of a threat are we identifying, how much of that threat is being realized within our environment. We're able to do that because we're not completely reliant on anything on premise. So those are just some of the advantages to the environment. And essentially, as I mentioned before, with the incident command system, being able to work with other city agencies and bring them into that environment to remotely respond swiftly was important for us.
Colin?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think when we built the environment, we had obviously a very substantial challenge, but also an incredible opportunity. We needed something that was flexible, that was modular, that was performant. It had certain characteristics. Like I said, we selected a cloud first and a zero trust. So that's an opportunity, not a challenge, frankly. So we're at arm's length, if you want to think of it like that, from essentially all of these city entities. And that means that we're able to onboard new sources of data very quickly in a very prescribed manner. As Q mentioned, we can bring in other entities to collaborate with relative ease and a specified level of surety. We also use, for the most part, open source components. It's been said data is the new oil. And so one of the substantial advantages we wanted to bring to the city was not just build an incredible team of civil servants doing important work, but to collect security telemetry that meaningfully enhanced the city's security posture and ensure that that data was brought to the right analyst at the right time to make the right decision. And that data is one of the city's principal advantages. As Q mentioned, not many entities at all have the scale and scope and threat profile, frankly, of the city. So us treating data as one of the first and most important considerations in building this environment enabled us to substantially transform the city's risk profile. In addition to, obviously, as Q mentioned, there is an ongoing incident response necessity that doesn't change and won't ever change. But the city is the one that is operating this data environment with civil servants, and we're doing it in a way that I think the city, your city, the city residents should be proud of, and I think will continue to bring benefit to the city as an enterprise over the long term.
Thanks both. Quick question. One of the things, so we've all been saying for a long time that, the cloud will be the savior for all of us. It's going to enable people who don't have the time and energy to do security to sort of just consume security and be more secure from the start. The challenge is that in practice, that hasn't always worked out. And I'm thinking in particular about the Rapid7 NYCR report from over the summer that in practice, most entities moving to the cloud don't improve their security posture. If you'll pardon the rough language, they take a crap infrastructure and they move it to the cloud and they have a crap cloud infrastructure. So what advice would you give other cities that are trying to do this, or even major corporations, because it's really the same problem, to avoid that challenge?
Yeah, I think a couple of sayings that have always helped us is that you want to bring your workload to the cloud. Don't bring your cloud to the workload. So don't try to lift and shift. Try to take the cloud and its both challenges and opportunities as things that need to be considered on an architecture level, kind of before you start clicking buttons. I would say also in theory, practice and theory are the same, and in practice they are not. So in theory, there's a lot of things that might work in a particular cloud environment. In practice, there are far fewer things for a particular cloud environment that will be able to be executed well by either a team in the general sense or your team, given their knowledge, skills, and abilities. I think one of the advantages that we had was a green field and incredible executive support from the city's highest elected officials on down. We also treated, I think, allowing computers to do computer stuff and people to do people stuff. So I mentioned infrastructure as code. I think that is probably, the infrastructure as code as a operational model and the zero trust framework as a security architecture, I think are the two most important elements for any successful cloud deployment, because otherwise you might have maybe I wouldn't use your words, but a less than ideal infrastructure that just happens to be more internet exposed. And that obviously would be not, driving business value or what have you. So I think that treating, for example, in the cloud, we treat our infrastructure as a software engineering problem. And that enables us to take, source code reviews and automated build tests and continuous integration and all these fancy buzzwords that basically means we're letting computers and robots do computer stuff, and we're enabling people to do people stuff. And that's enabled us to be successful in delivering, business value and being careful stewards of taxpayer resources, and also evolving the manners in which a local government, but a very significant local government, is delivering a critical service.
Thanks, Colin. Q,
Go
ahead.
I was just going to briefly add to that. The dual responsibility is really important when you're moving to the cloud, right? Organizations tend to move to the cloud and think that it's now the cloud service provider's opportunity and responsibility to take over their workload, and they miss the opportunity for the dual responsibility. And I think there will always be new technology, new threats, new vulnerabilities, etc. But leaders should really focus on building the right structure to sustain and to absorb.
So a follow-up question, Q. Colin talked a little bit about automation and the importance of automation. Can you address that in the space that you work, and particularly things like monitoring and incident response, and how you bring automation to those mission spaces?
Sure thing. So automation and orchestration is a huge part of our operation. We created a whole team around it, our counter threat automation group. And essentially, we looked at this as in our human resources are finite, right? So the problem set is going to continue to grow. However, there is a cap on the number of people that we can bring into the organization. So how can, to Colin's point, we allow computers to do computer work and humans be enabled to do what we hired them to do? So we use automation and orchestration throughout the threat management function, in specific, just because one, it allows us to move with speed, right? So when we think about triaging, whether that be triaging endpoints or particular events, we want to be able to understand various components of the network, and we can build in these playbooks to allow us or enable our analysts to have more information at their fingertips. You know, tasks that would take particularly 20 to 30 minutes can now take 5 minutes, and that's anywhere handling anything from identification of a threat to your notification to any type of triaging and response. So our automation workflows have allowed us to really streamline a lot of our efforts and to give our analysts the time that they require to focus on more interesting and technically challenging pieces of the analysis.
Great, thanks, Q. Thanks, Colin. So I just wanted to highlight for participants and for listeners that if you want to ask a question, you can do that through the chat box in the control panel, and that'll get relayed to us so that we can try to get some of them a little bit later in the session. We have still about 23 minutes left. So y'all have done all of this really great work. You're going through, the mission's expanding, and it's late February, early March of 2020, and a pandemic hits. Can you talk to the audience a little bit about, what was happening in your scope, what you were covering, what was happening to your metrics before, and then what happened after the pandemic and where we are right now in terms of what the challenges are, how much you're trying to cover, those sorts of things. And I'll let either one of you go first.
Sure. I think, from my perspective, obviously we watch world events very closely. New York City is a center of global commerce. I think it was maybe March 13th or March 12th where we got the notification from our leadership at City Hall that, basically when feasible, you can please transition as many of your workforce to a remote posture as possible. And I'm extremely proud to say that we were able that same day, without a single configuration change, to move 100 plus personnel from our agency to a fully remote work posture with essentially no degradation in the important function that Q's team undertakes. And that was the culmination of this cloud first journey. That was the end of this multi-year process that Geoff mentioned, starting in Executive Order 28 and with the environment that we built. And so that kind of, all really culminated in that one afternoon where basically 100 people picked up their laptops. And I think we're substantially safer because of it. From a metric standpoint, we saw a substantial increase in certain kinds of security devices, adding telemetry to our environment. We saw very, very substantial increases in the security telemetry that our organization was processing, and Q can speak from her perspective about how that manifested itself from an incident response perspective. But like I said, we're on the public cloud, and we're using components and a methodology called reliability engineering. So that enabled us to take this challenge and transform it into a substantial inflection point for our organization where, yes, it was an enormous challenge, No, it was not perfect, but I'm very proud of the work that we did to prepare for that event, and that our organization continues to do to ensure that Q's team has the data they need to do their job, and the security tooling that we have in place throughout the city continues to make meaningful impact on the city's threat surface day in and day out.
Q?
Yeah, so I would say that for one, we had to really build from an operational standpoint. We already thought about what the responders required to function effectively. However, exercising that and moving completely to a remote posture was interesting in that we had to think about very simply moving a centralized SOC to a dispersed but centrally managed SOC, right? So we wanted to maintain all aspects of our 24/7 coverage. And in doing so, we had to think about even something as simple as phone coverage and assess the impact of that. And we had to build out processes for consistent coverage, technical rollover, all of the process-driven components that are not necessarily serviced by the technology, and that's why we always break down the resilience effort into process, people, technology. But I guess tactically and still operationally, we had to think about the attack surface growing, right? So additional remote access points, additional devices coming into those remote access points. Colin mentioned a bit of the uptick in network telemetry just based on the sheer volume of access from outside of the environment. We had to think about metrics related to COVID, how adversaries were taking advantage of this opportunity and the new threats being posed. Mostly same type of threat vector, but different opportunity. We also had to deal with the myriad of new devices coming online, right? So tablets for student education, the rollout of endpoint protection for those devices, quickly building processes to manage the various types of nefarious activity that could occur on those devices. So from an intelligence standpoint, we really just thought about one, our attack surface and the threats posed, but then from a detection and response perspective, what are all of the pieces that we need to consider to remotely respond in the manner that the city has come accustomed to us doing.
Can one of you talk a little bit about how the scope of coverage has changed during the life of NYC3 in terms of number of devices and applications you monitor, number of events you see every day?
Sure. As Geoff mentioned, and your guests will forgive me for probably artfully dodging some components of that question and less artfully dodging others. But we started out with an organization that had a viewpoint on a significant, although certainly not complete, picture of the city's, say, endpoint stack. And the city has, hundreds of thousands of endpoints spread across 100+ agencies. So the first order of business was to expand the visibility and control we had over city-owned endpoint devices. And by that, I mean servers, workstations, and mobile devices. So that was kind of job one. And we were able to grow that visibility and control footprint in excess of 7x. So we basically took, the initial starting figure and multiplied it by over 7 throughout the first part of our organization's journey to expand visibility and control. The second thing was, to Q's point and to Geoff's earlier point, you can't defend what you can't see. So there's obviously a lot of other security relevant data that happens around the city, identity data, critical applications, network security devices, etc. And we very, very substantially increased the volume and type of those security devices that we were ingesting, normalizing, and ensuring that our threat responders could process. And so we increased that by orders of magnitude over what it had been before. We also enhanced some other processes we stood up a team that was dedicated to what we call urban technology or critical infrastructure and connected devices. We revamped the city's software security accreditation program. So if you think about the three pillars that we selected, we had the identities, we had the endpoints, and we had applications. We were able to meaningfully enhance our visibility and control over all three of those pillars of our program.
Q, anything to add?
Yeah, I would say that it's interesting because it's like once you have everything at your fingertips from a data perspective, now what do you do with it? And this is where our programs really puzzle piece together, is that we need all of the data, we need all of the telemetry, and apologies for my dog in the background. But at the same time, the structure is so important once we do have it at our fingertips, right? So this is where the city has really focused on the agency incident readiness and response initiative, where that has allowed us to truly focus on incident response preparation and coordination with every single agency throughout the city. And when we do have a day that is challenging, I'll say, then we know what is at our disposal from a tools and technology perspective. We know how to properly communicate. We know the structure that we have in place. We know all of the playbooks that need to be executed. So it's not that we won't have a challenging time, but it will be very well thought out. Everyone will know what is to be done, and we'll just better set ourselves up for success.
And Phil, if I could just add maybe one more thing from maybe an architectural philosophy. We moved, and you might say, from a client server model, or a traditional approach where there's what, a traditional, we have the one big thing and everybody sends it to there, to what is called a publish and subscribe framework. So as to kind of build slightly on what Q said, this model enables this outlook and this business value be derived from this data in a manner which is not really feasible to do in a quote unquote traditional context.
So there's one thing I wanted to drill on that Q raised before, because she talked about people, process, and technology. So y'all are just going along really great. Things are successful. You're lucky and you're super smart because you built the things that will enable you to operate after the pandemic hits effectively with minimal degradation, and in some ways the ability to move up and continue to improve. A lot of that is people, a lot of that is process and technology. So how do you handle the people part of remote work and remote monitoring? You can't send one of your forensics people just down the hallway to pull somebody's computer off and image it if there's a problem. How do you work across both the awareness and response and other human pieces of that?
That's a very loaded question, and that's why I go back to structure, and to the initiative that I just mentioned with our agency incident response readiness program. We thought about all of that, coupling that with our resilience program, right? So when we think about people, process, technology, from a people perspective, when we just think about resilience, we asked ourselves a bunch of questions. What do our people need to work effectively? How well are our personnel cross-trained? How long can they operate at X percentage if we have a reduction in workforce? And then from a process perspective, it's like, what workarounds do we have? What are our essential services? So really mapping out all of our technology processes and all of the dependencies. What do we actually rely on to be successful? We were able to determine where we had gaps in our program, what gaps needed to be filled, how can we do so? And to your point about remote work and remote response, we spent a lot of time thinking about remote response, because even if we're not in a pandemic, this is still a huge city. Right? So it takes time to go to another borough to collect the device to do some forensic analysis on it. So that's not a place we want to be, especially when we prize speed. So with some of the deployment in the technologies that we chose, we ensured that we had the controls in place that allowed us to collect forensic evidence from those devices. That puts us in a position to faster triage and make certain decisions based on the telemetry that we have in our hands. And then if we need to do some more of this deeper response, we have built out in that same environment that we spoke about, the ability to have that information uploaded. So we can have this tight coordination with various agencies throughout the city and execute on some of those processes. So I won't say that we're completely resilient at the moment, even though our vision is to be the most cyber resilient city in this world. However, we're making a lot of strides towards that.
Yeah, and I think, Phil, you spend a lot of time on it. I think each member of the executive staff and the managers are expected to spend a lot of time talking with their team, mentoring them, developing individual and team training programs, sponsoring professional development, making people a focus of the organization. And we have our equation, which is facts plus judgment plus culture equals trust. And our goal is for our residents, visitors, and businesses of this great city to trust us, and for our staff to trust that this is a place where you can come and do your best work. We have an incredibly important mission. We have, the vision of the city's leadership to carry it out in new and important and interesting ways. And we think that attracts a certain kind of professional that demands, they are entitled to and demand excellent leadership.
Great, thanks, Colin. Geoff, perhaps you could join us again and we'll do some questions before we close. One of the questions we have is about the zero trust infrastructure. And the question came in, there are a lot of naysayers, or at least some naysayers about that. What's your advice on where companies should start or organizations should start in making that move?
Maybe I'll jump in. And so I think the place we started was with identity. And there's a lot of different ways to think about identity. But the place we started with our zero trust journey was ensuring that we had the very tightest control over the user identities that it is possible to have. And that's by using something called a FIDO key, which is in my computer and I won't leave the shot to go get. But that uses as a second, it's a cryptographic second factor. And that is basically ensuring that your users are in possession of this physical token. And if you think back to recent events, the Twitter hack, etc., user identities are a natural and substantial threat surface for adversaries to exploit, and therefore for you to think carefully about. So that's where we started. Again, it is a journey. It's a big city. None of these things happen overnight. But with the investment of people, process, and technology, as Q mentioned, we're able to make very substantial improvements in a user identity environment. And the second thing is endpoints, user endpoints. As Geoff mentioned at the top, the kind of two most prominent attack surfaces are users that click phishing emails on corporate devices. So we focused on those two elements, and I think those are the two places that I would advocate to take a look at if you're going down that path.
Thanks, Colin. So we're going to go to a lightning round now to try and keep answers short so we can get as many questions as we can. The next lightning round question is for CISO Brown. Geoff, what are the opportunities, initiatives the team is looking at for the future?
Terrific, a question about the future. That's what I was hoping I would get something like that. So I want to highlight when I was off camera, I took a minute to look up the title of this session, Inconceivable, right? So Inconceivable, I looked up the definition and it's not capable of being imagined or grasped mentally. Unbelievable. So that's a definition of inconceivable. Sometimes I think of the word as surprise, right? And what has 2020 done except for perhaps surprise us? So when we build our cybersecurity solutions, a lot of times we are recognizing that an impact, an incident, something can happen at any time, right? No matter how well you're defending, you have to be prepared to respond. That's what we think about as cyber defenders, right? But sometimes I would say surprises come from unexpected places, maybe inconceivable places. Maybe that's what 2020 has taught us, right? So I might say 2020, let alone the year thereafter and the year thereafter, might have more tricks up its sleeve. So how are you thinking about the future? How are you embracing innovation? You heard about a lot of the innovation, a lot of the thinking from Colin and Quiessence and Phil's recent conversation. So when I think about the future, what I'm thinking the most about really is not just how to have confidence that the things that we're doing to build a better cyber defense will apply when inconceivable things happen in the city. But what I'm really thinking about is how we as a community of cyber defenders can do a better job together. In my session with Phil, we talked a little bit about what New York City is thinking about when it comes to private-public partnerships. But really, I think about the community of cyber defenders, two things. One, all of us know we need to expand that community of cyber defenders. We need more of us, right? And the key to doing that, in my estimation, is to make sure that we reflect the diversity and the inclusion of the people that we serve in our mission set. Let's expand out and let's bring people into the cyber defense mission. Another thing that I've been thinking a lot about is where to apply them. Your question really was about what are we thinking about in the future. I'm thinking a lot about convergence. If this moment in time has taught us anything, that's we need to be able to work from offices, but we need to be able to work from home. We need to be able to work from wherever we may be. And within that circumstances, we may come into contact with devices that aren't enterprise devices. You know, when we have perhaps children who are practicing their trumpet lessons upstairs or doing their homework or doing other things, and other professionals who work in other enterprises right around us. How are we thinking about the cyber defense of that threat surface? But beyond that, as in our city, as I think about the future, the city, and any city really, is moving towards a greater digital space. So that physical digital convergence is a place where cyber defenders should be really, really thinking about innovating. How can we take the lessons that we've learned securing digital space and applying them in physical space so people can have more confidence as they're coming back together, as they are together, that they're safe? And let's do that in ways that respect the values of the people we serve. That's what I think about when it comes to the future.
So I'm going to cover one more question before we do the closing. And I'm going to ask each of you to answer this pretty briefly. So that is, what do you think one of your top successes is that in the time that has occurred to now? And what do you see as one of the greatest challenges going forward? And we'll close with you, Geoff, since you just finished speaking. On my screen, Q, you're right next to me on the upper right. So I'm going to start with you. A success and a challenge.
A success would be socialization of our mission and getting the whole city on board with ensuring that security is baked in from the onset. A challenge is still the size and scale of this very large and interesting city.
Great. Colin?
I think a great success is the team we've been able to build. The 100+ civil servants doing this mission day in and day out, doing things in the cloud and zero trust and highly automated incident response. I'm incredibly proud of the cadre of civil service professionals we've built and the partners we have in the public and private sector. So this big team. And a challenge is changing culture, is making people, while balancing a series of scarce resources and very real operational risks and challenges, ensuring that we continue to manage this threat surface as attacks against the city grow not only more sophisticated, but more numerous.
Great. Geoff, thank you.
So I think the success was simply in deciding. I think the main success was the decision made by New York City to take cybersecurity as seriously as you've heard over the course of the last hour. That was a huge success. I think the challenges going forward are making more decisions. One decision is that cybersecurity isn't a technology issue. I've said before, and I stole this analogy, you have to think of cybersecurity as a game of chess. The technology is the chessboard and the chess pieces. But in cybersecurity, we have the word security in there for a reason. It's because we as defenders have a sentient thinking opponent across the board from us. And you really need to make sure that wherever you serve the cyber defense mission, that fundamental reality is recognized. And through that, another decision needs to be made. And I think whether you're talking cybersecurity or pandemic or what's to come, the other decision that has to be made is that we're all in this together. The community of cyber defenders needs to work together, not just human to human, but machine to machine, in order to meet its mission objectives. And those mission objectives matter. It matters to New Yorkers, and it matters to customers, it matters to consumers, it matters to society. And those are the decisions that are in front of us.
Hear, hear. Well said, Geoff. So I'm going to ask you to take us home with a final brief question. I'm very impressed with everything New York City has accomplished. You know, I'm fond of saying that when it comes to national efforts, that the United Kingdom has been sort of the gold standard for a national approach and a national strategy. New York City is clearly the gold standard for a city approach. If our listeners or future listeners want to try to emulate what you have done, what's your best advice about how to approach it and how to accelerate their movement into the place that you have moved?
I think the most powerful thing we did was made a decision that our mission was about New Yorkers. It was about meeting the expectation of New Yorkers in the way that New Yorkers expect out of their government. So I might say, whether you're in a different city, and please, if you're in a different city, call us. We would love to have a conversation. We'll tell you the things that we failed at. We'll tell you the things that we think we succeeded at. We'll tell you whatever we can to help your mission. But the statement goes beyond cities. It goes to enterprises. It goes to NGOs. It goes to partners. It goes to, establishing global norms. When it comes down to it, you have to make a fundamental decision, like, who are you? Who does the success of your mission depend on? That's the key question. Who does the success of your mission depend on? Go there, and that's where you'll find your drive.
Excellent. Well, Geoff, Q, Colin, thanks very much for your time today. It was a fascinating discussion. Thanks to all of our listeners for enjoying this presentation. And please do feel free to reach out to Geoff and team if they can be of help to you if you're a city. And we're also happy at the Global Cyber Alliance to share what we know, our tools and techniques. So feel free to send us an email at info@globalcyberalliance.org. So thanks, everybody, and have a good day.
Thank you. Bye.